This podcast is brought to you by Conquer Cancer, the ASCO Foundation. Our mission is to accelerate breakthroughs in life-saving research and empower people everywhere to conquer cancer. Welcome to Your Stories, a podcast where we hear candid stories from people conquering cancer. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Lewis. Gabriele Gabe Grunewald was a professional distance runner and a relentless optimist. She competed in Big Ten championship races, became an NCAA track and field All-American athlete, and finished fourth in the 2012 U.S. Olympic trials. Her best time in the 1,500 meters was 4 minutes, 1.48 seconds, making her the 11th fastest performer in U.S. history. All those accomplishments are impressive enough on their own, but they become even more so when you learn that even as she racked up accolades and wins, she also faced cancer numerous times. In 2009, Gabe was diagnosed with adenoid cystic carcinoma, or ACC for short, a rare type of salivary gland cancer. Then in 2010, she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. Despite these circumstances, Gabe persevered, continuing to train and run professionally. She also became a rare cancer advocate, launching the Brave Like Gabe Foundation to encourage other patients and survivors to embrace their own courage and chase their dreams. In her own words, "I would love to live in a world where rare cancer patients have more treatment options and ultimately cures. And if I can't live in that world, I want to help it become a possibility for future patients." In June 2019, after a decade of living with ACC, Gabe passed away at her home in Minneapolis, surrounded by loved ones, including her husband, Dr. Justin Grunewald, an ultramarathon runner himself, as well as an internal medicine specialist and chair of the Brave Like Gabe Foundation's Rare Cancer Research Working Group. Dr. Grunewald has an array of experience and insight related to advocating for the health and well-being of patients with cancer. Today, he joins the Your Stories podcast to share more about Gabe's story and legacy, along with the importance of supporting rare cancer research so that patients with these rare diseases have more hope for better outcomes. Welcome, Dr. Grunewald. It is absolutely an honor to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Is it okay if I call you Justin?
Yeah, please.
Awesome. So Justin, before we get started, let's hear where you're joining us from today.
Yeah, I'm back at my home now in Boulder, Colorado. I still work in Minneapolis, and then kind of weird fly commute to work. I work for a long week, and then come back here and run in the mountains.
And just to give our listeners context, before we started recording, I asked you, did you have a time that you needed to end the conversation? You said, well, I need to go running. You said the longer we talk, the hotter it's going to get. So on the one hand, I want to make sure I give you the full platform, but I have to say, just you saying that resonated so much with what I know about you and Gabe. So if you don't mind, let's start with her. How did the two of you meet?
Well, it's maybe controversial, maybe not, but the first time I ever saw Gabriele was our freshman year at the University of Minnesota. All the freshmen, there's a quad of dorms that all kind of abut each other, but some track and field cross-country athletes were playing basketball, and that was the first time we actually, I think, met. We probably crossed paths at a few high school cross-country races, both running in Minnesota, but actually met, played basketball, saw her competitive spirit firsthand on the basketball court.
I love that. I think that's actually sort of like the meet cute you would see in like a romantic comedy. I love that. I can see how your mutual athleticism would sort of draw you to one another. And like you said, it sounds like her spirit was evident from the beginning. Pivoting a little bit, but I think importantly, the through line here is, again, Gabe's spirit. Can you tell us a little bit about her diagnosis, maybe how she discovered this rare cancer and then the effect that it had on your lives together?
Yeah, we were both athletes at the University of Minnesota, so had like a redshirt year, but my fifth year senior year, her fifth year senior year, she had kind of like a bump on her salivary parotid gland that had been bugging her, went to the athletic department, eventually got referred to ear, nose, and throat, got a biopsy, and then we were at a track meet at Arizona State University, so in Tempe, Arizona, and my race was that night, her race was the next night, but she got a call from her ear, nose, and throat doctor who said, your biopsy wasn't great. We need to have surgery like next week. So in her winning ways, she went out the next day. She didn't have to race, but she set a lifetime best at 1,500 meters the next day after that news. And then I think went in for what ended up being a neck dissection, pretty significant surgery just a couple days later, and then had a summer of radiation, and then thankfully got a athletic hardship waiver for that year, and then came back. And as you said in the intro, she went from never being an All-American to getting second place at the Division I NCAA meet, just kind of in spite or to spite cancer, I guess.
I love that. Yeah, spite is a powerful motivator. So obviously, Justin, you've gone through your own experience here, and you're a physician. Especially with what you know now, what went through your mind, either at the time or even in hindsight, when you think about Gabe's diagnosis specifically with such a rare cancer?
Well, initially, being an undergrad, doing what you don't want to do, and her telling me at the hotel, we were at next door hotels, but the diagnosis, you Google it, and I think at that time there were 0 clinical trials, 0 treatments, and the bold words you read are like an 80% 5-year expectancy and then a quite low 10-year expectancy, which is kind of opposed to most cancer. Usually when you live longer, it means you're less likely to re-encounter. So that particular cancer is not great in that manner, that kind of the longer you live, if you're not clear of disease, kind of the more scary it gets. I mean, that was scary, obviously. And then as my medical training ensued, it was useful in kind of engaging experts, getting resources quickly. It's still wild to me how difficult it is to navigate something like cancer, getting the right doctor, getting the right specialist. And then I feel horrible for people going through rare cancer diagnoses, and hopefully they have a great team. But ultimately, we tried a lot of stuff. Every 3 months, maybe you'd get a scan where there was stability and it'd be exciting. And then maybe something wouldn't be stable and it was less exciting, but kind of common ground was to run through it, survive through it. We lived our life 3 months at a time, which I'd recommend. I mean, it's probably not financially feasible for most people to live life 3 months at a time, but if you kind of just forget the future and maybe do it for a year, it's a pretty incredible way to live.
That's absolutely incredible perspective. It's like it builds on the one day at a time philosophy there, I think, but also like you're saying, I think has a very sort of clear-eyed view of mortality and or a hazy view into the distance, especially as you get beyond months into years. There's a lot to unpack in your answer, and specifically what you both did at the time of Gabe's diagnosis. Justin, so you mentioned that you went online for information. We know there's actually really good research that, and it makes sense, in the internet age, 97% of people at the time of diagnosis with any cancer will go online, and almost all of them will go to Google first. And as a general rule, the rarer the cancer, unless you know you carry a genetic syndrome that heightens your risk for a particular tumor, we're not going to screen you for that. There's also, and you and I know this term in science, this notion of pretest probability. I mean, Gabe was a young, spectacularly healthy woman. And, even with the benefit of our retrospectoscope, you kind of wonder, as that mass was being worked up, yeah, it was much more likely, it seemed, that this would be a benign growth in such a young, healthy person. I want to touch later on the fact that she sort of upends the notion that cancer is a disease that happens because you've done something, that you've had unhealthy behavior. I think that's a very important myth that we need to puncture together. But then finally, again, as physician scientists, you and I know that the bedrock for so much clinical medicine and oncology in particular is randomized controlled trials. They are sort of the ultimate litmus test of what works against what doesn't, or at least what works against the current standard of care. In one way or another, the scientific community has been doing randomized controlled trials for well over 2 centuries at this point. But the problem is the statistical part of it, to have power, to have faith, if you will, in the conclusions, you need large numbers of people and you need to split them into groups. And I think the problem with rare cancers is that it's extremely difficult to aggregate enough patients to perform these trials well and to have conclusions that we can then extrapolate. So what I'm finally leading back to is this is why I think anecdotal data stories, and don't get me wrong, the whole point of today is to get Gabe's story out to an audience, but to use her experience as a template for another person with even ACC may not be entirely appropriate. And I think the rarer the tumor, the more you have to individualize care. But then as the oncologist, it becomes hard to actually counsel the patient and their loved ones on how they're going to do. And I have to say, one of the things that really struck me watching this documentary about Gabe was you and she and her trainers were all trying to figure out how the regimens would fit into her training. And that part really struck me because for a moment, I put myself on the oncologist side of the table and I thought, gosh, like you said, maybe the window that you can foresee is maybe 3 months, and then you're going to reassess. And so that scan to scan living, there's two ways of looking at it. One is you can sort of feel the weight of the next scan constantly on top of you. My patients refer to it as scanxiety. I don't know if that was a word that Gabe ever used.
Definitely.
But on the other hand, like you said, like she clearly, and again, I was so moved to watch the documentary about her and to talk to you about her. Like she clearly used it as like this fuel, like this impetus to make the most of her time and really be very intentional about it. So again, using your experience together, when it comes to understanding and managing rare cancers, Justin, what do you feel is the biggest need among patients and their loved ones in the rare cancer community?
I mean, I think in reality, the biggest need, as you kind of alluded to, is something to relate to almost, because there's not a template. Each person is unfortunately an N of one. And then as medicine progresses, it's incredible to have targeted therapies, very nuanced protein gene-based therapies. So each ACC isn't ACC. And I don't know if it's commonly known, but she had perineural invasion. So her stage at the early onset was facial nerve invasion between or behind under her skull base that they could not eradicate the cancer. So we knew there were rogue cells from day one. That's why I hate to throw ACC as this like catastrophic event, because some people will have a surgery and be cured of the disease. And I think that's an incredible thing. So I don't want everyone to say she had it, she's this phenomenal athlete, she didn't survive it. Like there's no chance in hell I'll survive it, because that's not the case. Each case is an individual basis. But having something, again, like Google's terrible, but if you could Google it and it be like, there's one clinical trial going, just to know someone is even acknowledging your cancer, I think goes such a long way. I don't mean acknowledging it, but there's some lab somewhere that's thinking about it.
So actually, I manage rare cancers. About 1 in 4 of my patients in my practice arguably has a rare cancer. You and I can also talk about how do we define a rare cancer? And one definition, probably the most predominant definition, actually comes from the National Cancer Institute and says, well, it's cancers that carry fewer than 100,000 diagnoses per year. And ACC is certainly one of those. But what's interesting is, and you know this, Justin, if you actually aggregated all of the different rare tumor diagnoses, it would be incredibly prevalent, or arguably it would be in the top 10 of all different tumor types if we just sort of, again, aggregated them like that. I think a lack of research is one of the biggest challenges in the rare cancer landscape. Were there specific moments during Gabe's cancer experience where maybe you or the two of you thought, why don't we know more about this? And then just be honest with me, and you've been certainly perfectly candid so far. Was that frustrating? And how did Gabe herself deal with that?
It was incredibly frustrating, I guess, in ways. And once she had metastatic disease, it was felt as though the hourglass sand was running, because there is no treatment. There's only so much surgery you can humanely put yourself through. One thing she loved was good food or good drink. And then when you go on this medicine that flames your mouth, it kind of ruins to where the only thing that tastes good is pink strawberry Panera lemonade or something. So you have to hang it all in the balance. And I do think ultimately we weighed it down to what she wanted to do and what she thought she could tolerate. But certain medicines, it was like, no, I just can't.
You actually said it perfectly. I think as an oncologist, my job, to the best of my ability, is to try to balance effectiveness and tolerance. And the latter, as you've already said, is often sorely lacking. And that's particularly gutting when you've incurred a lot of toxicity. And then, like you said, you go in 3 months later for the scan, you find out it didn't work. I think that's sort of like double jeopardy because now you have progression and you know that you've incurred all these side effects, and it's really hard not to feel, especially as the doctor, but I can only imagine as the patient too, like the sense of, well, that was definitely not worthwhile. But just like looking for mutations, I think the other way of looking at it is you don't know unless you try. And I could certainly sense from, watching footage of Gabe that she was willing to try to the very best of her ability. One of the most moving images to me, Justin, was seeing her compete where she clearly had her hepatectomy scar. And I just remember thinking, gosh, the amount of recovery that she had to go through, not just physically, but mentally, to get over a massive abdominal surgery like that and then get back up to that level of performance as an athlete, just truly incredible. Obviously, not all of us are going to be runners like Gabe or you, but can you share a story about a time that you know that Gabe empowered another patient or a survivor that you're aware of?
As she was passing, I guess I was very open about it on social media, Instagram, and thousands of messages she received, which I think some of the most touching messages were the people that had debilitating anxiety or depression that stepped out the door and went for a run and maybe found their own cure through doing that. And some of the heartfelt messages that were like, frankly, I didn't have reason to go on. I was ready. I had a plan set. And then I found this and I thought if she could go through this, maybe I can. And a lot of those stories from people dealing with cancer, but a lot of people dealing with a lot of mental health struggles where I was like, man, I think a lot more data will come out and has come out about people treating PTSD, anxiety, veterans with exercise, with focused exercise, and doing so much better than your common SSRI or whatever else.
You may have heard this, Justin. I've heard it said that if exercise was a pill, it would be worth trillions of dollars for all of its many health benefits. And I have to wonder, actually, the extent to which you think her exercise was itself an exercise is actually underselling it. Her performance was it part of her coping mechanism?
I alluded to it on social media like a month ago, maybe, but I was in my residency working a lot, too much, and got home from a night shift. And she had just run the Olympic trials in 2016, and something had felt off. Again, the retrospectoscope is always clear, but her breathing was off all season. Her physio said her right diaphragm was off. And then I gave her a hug after my shift coming home at 7 a.m. And I said, you feel a little protuberant. And then we went in later that day to an ER because her mind started running. And I knew I worked at the hospital, got an expedited ER visit. The ER provider, deer in the headlights. I felt terrible for them, but telling us she had a softball cantaloupe-sized tumor in her liver when she had just gotten back from a race in Monaco, racing the best people in the world over 3,000 meters. You never want to look at a scan, I think, as a provider, patient care, but seeing it pushing her diaphragm massively up and her lung having half the space to work as a world-class athlete. But again, a long story short, we went home. We walked the streets of Minneapolis all night. She had 200-meter repeats on the docket the next day. And come hell or high water, she was going to do those 200-meter repeats because it's frankly really hard to feel bad for yourself and also really hard not to have lactic acid fill your brain when you're running 200-meter repeats all out at Olympic effort. So we did that, scheduled surgery. She went in, had her wedge resection and partial hepatectomy. But the next day, it was definitely a coping mechanism. And you can't cry when you're running an all-out 200. I think it's physically impossible because you're gasping for air, and the crying function doesn't work with that.
Yeah, it's like the physiologic hierarchy of need. You gotta focus on what your body is capable of at that moment. That narrative you just told is truly remarkable. One, I've heard about the runner's high and the endorphins, but what Gabe was able to accomplish, truly incredible. And just so our audience gets what you just said, I'm a GI oncologist. I deal with the liver a lot. As you know, Justin, the vast majority of the liver has no nerve endings. So a lot of times people actually don't even know, for better or for worse, usually for worse, that something's growing in their liver. But it also occupies an important amount of space. So what Gabe was able to do is really absolutely incredible, because what you just said was her liver was pushing up on her diaphragm so much that from below, it was moving the diaphragm just like her physiotherapist detected, and essentially obliterating, sounds like a good half of her right lung capacity. And yet she was able to compete at the highest level. I mean, that's just, especially looking back on it, that's a truly remarkable testament to not just her athleticism, but her perseverance. As it happens, the maybe common thread between our families, I am not from a family of athletes, but my dad was 42 when he discovered a tumor, a rare tumor occupying his entire right lung, when he had the lung removed. And he began what he called the slow puffing process of proving its redundancy. But he wasn't a performance athlete, he was a professor. So he just had to summon the air to talk at a podium. What Gabe was able to accomplish, that is just absolutely amazing. And again, it's inspiring. To anyone in the audience that's familiar with the work of David Goggins, what Gabe reminds me of is a much nicer, less profane version of David Goggins. For anyone that needs the inspiration to go strap on some running shoes, really pretty incredible. So, Justin, I know we're nearing the end of our conversation. I want to touch on just a couple of things here near the end. One is I want to talk about the work that you're doing as at least part of Gabe's legacy. So, organizations like the Brave Like Gabe Foundation and Cancer, the ASCO Foundation, they support research into rare and underfunded types of cancer. And as you said, you don't really know what return on investment you're going to get as an individual. How would you describe to a potential donor the impact that helping to support research has, not just for patients with rare cancers, but sort of across the spectrum?
So our funding, a good amount goes to rare cancers, being targeted therapies, immunotherapies, is super exciting. A couple of years back now, they had a study where a bunch of people with rectal cancer, untreatable, uncurable, went on this trial, and all of them were cured by this trial. And some of our funding went into that. So that was the first time I just felt like a grand slam was hit. And it was like, man, millions of dollars go in. And I mean, one life is worth infinite dollars. Just to know these people can go home to their loved ones and be cancer free, even long term. But just if you have that 3-month increment, 6 month. So we fund that. We fund some fellows that research rare cancer. And then we fund at the University of Minnesota a fellow through some osteosarcoma, a pediatric rare cancer, just to keep some funding close to home because the organization is based out of Minnesota. With that funding, again, these fellows are doing things like Langerhans cell, like just very rare, nuanced things. But I hope, in hopes, someone who is affected by these things can Google it and see, wow, someone at this institute is researching my cancer. I think that's huge just for the perspective piece of those patients. And then we don't necessarily pump funding into this, but we hope to inspire people to stay active, to stay both physically active, engaged in their pursuits of whatever it is, whether you swim, row, run, bike, anything. It doesn't, as we know, but don't overly emphasize, outcomes are so much better and tolerance of treatment is so much better when you're fitter going in. And you never, again, like you talk about Gabriele, she's this crazy fit athlete who has no idea what's coming at her, but she was so fit going in. I think part of her resilience in wanting to entertain the idea of going through those treatments was by her taking those, she's still a clinical trial herself, and she can go through some of the adverse effects that maybe someone else isn't going to tolerate. Not that you want to make yourself a petri dish, but she knew she could handle it. So maybe pumping through different treatments would help someone in the future not have to even go through that. Like that's part of the counterbalance of doing it.
A remarkable answer. Thank you. I mean, the selflessness in what you just said, and by extension, the selflessness that Gabe had, the way I feel about it is this, is that, listen, it's very odd to live in the moment as an oncologist in the sense of knowing that people are going to look back on the chemotherapy era the way that we currently look back on, say, bloodletting or doctors who invoked disturbance of the humors. Like, I know right now that history is going to judge me harshly, and it should. On the other hand, we do these things because they are currently the best we can offer often. And the only way to get better is through research. And I think every patient who enrolls in a trial is doing a service to the field. Now, the hard part, as you and Gabe experienced, is it doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself are going to benefit. the whole point of research is that we don't know going in that a experimental therapy is going to work. And you're right, that can make people feel a lot like a guinea pig, even though there's obviously quite a lot of scientific rigor and often sort of preclinical basic science research that undergirds these trials. So I think that's an important thing to say. The other thing I wanted to say is your whole point about Gabe sort of keeping moving into her fitness. Two things there quickly, and then I'll let you have the final word, Justin. One is, to me, I think Gabe herself is a huge counter argument against this notion that, oh, if you get cancer, it's because you did something unhealthy, as I said earlier in the interview. So Siddhartha Mukherjee, who I think is like the poet laureate of oncology and has written incredible books like The Emperor of All Maladies, in his sequel book, The Gene, which was about basically all human disease, he says that illness is the sum of heredity, so our sort of inherited genetics, our lifestyle, environmental triggers, and chance. And I think that last one is the one that actually, whether they admit it or not, scares most people, because what it means is you can be the healthiest person around. And Gabe, I think, qualifies for that, and you can still get cancer. And again, the reason I'm ending with this is I'm not trying to fearmonger at all, but actually the other way of looking at it is we shouldn't be shaming people who get cancer. I think that's so counterproductive. And the fact that Gabe developed cancer while she was exercising at such a high level and then continued to exercise, again, I think sort of upends this, I'll call it like a bodily version of the prosperity gospel. Just because you are fit doesn't mean that you can't get cancer. On the other hand, if you can, and I know this is such a hard directive, but if you can stay active, stay moving, you don't have to be qualifying for the Olympics. But if you can stay moving during treatment, that almost always means that you can remain on treatment for longer. So that's the balancing act that I think oncologists and patients walk together. And Gabe's commitment to keeping moving, bodies in motion, staying in motion, I think is so telling. So finally, Justin, one of the things I really admire about you and Gabe, and having listened to her, is optimism. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of hope when it comes to conquering cancer?
It's definitely a hard balance. I think you need it, for lack of better. You do. I think even in medicine, I think when you're dealing with something catastrophic, or I think we probably see it when an elderly man or woman pass and then their spouse follows soon after. I don't think it's by chance. I think it's by being okay going, and you lost your partner, you lost your, probably the thing that keeps you inspired daily. So I think we'll never understand what it is, what hope is, why it makes a difference. But I do think it makes a difference, your daily attitude, mantra, whatever you call it, when you get down and out. It's just like athletics. I talk about athletics a ton. I run competitively in the ultra scene. When it's good, it's good. I can be less fit, but have a better attitude and more confidence, and I'm going to beat everyone. I can be the fittest guy on the starting line, but if I don't have hope or confidence, it's going to be a terrible day. It's everything in life, I think, whether it's going to work, dealing with cancer, dealing with treatment, having hope or having some sort of positive thoughts just massively benefits you.
There's a hope here that we haven't voiced that I think Gabe absolutely embodies, which is that the experience we have as patients can be a part of our legacy, and it can persist to help others. And Justin, I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that I think you are doing that, and I absolutely think she is doing that. So I am beyond honored that you would choose this platform to share and perpetuate her story, and just thank you.
You're welcome. No, yeah, and I appreciate continuing to spread her hope and resilience.
It's truly incredible. Again, it's motivating to me, and it makes me look at not just my practice, but my own life in a new light. So thank you so much. And thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by Conquer Cancer, the ASCO Foundation. Conquer Cancer is creating a world where cancer is prevented or cured, and every survivor is healthy. You can make a gift at conquer.org/podcast. The participants in this podcast report no conflicts of interest relevant to this podcast. Full disclosures can be found in the episode page on conquer.org.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.